Hey guys, welcome to the first episode of the UNinvested podcast. My name is Crockett Calloway.
I'm Sahil Seth.
And today we're going to be kicking off the inaugural episode of the podcast, Why Uninvested? To be completely honest, we're two broke college students. We don't have any money in the game. The only thing we have invested in the venture capital space is our own interest. And so every episode we're going to be breaking down exciting things that are happening in the space, really interesting investments that have recently happened, and really just general venture capital and investing news. So what are we going to be talking about today, Sahil?
So today we're going to be talking about Adobe's acquisition of Figma. For those of you that don't know, Adobe is really just the grandfather of everything design, Photoshop, Lightroom, all these applications, and they just bought, possibly one of the hottest startups, Figma, for $20 billion. And something we really want to get in here is how can they justify this sticker price of $20 billion?
It's interesting. We've seen before they've raised nearly $338 million in funding. And to date, the revenue is not at that. I mean, they bought it for $20 billion. What's their current revenue right now?
So they just doubled from $200 million to $400 million. So that's a 50x revenue multiple.
Yeah.
And for those of you that don't know what that means, essentially their sticker price is their revenues times some X amount. In this case, it was 20x, which is a number that would be crazy even a year ago when venture capital was pouring all this money into startups. Even now when we've pumped the brakes during this current recessionary environment that we're in.
So I think to justify that 50x multiple, we have to look at what are Adobe's motivations in the first place, right? Because we have not seen an acquisition like this. And by the way, the acquisition hasn't gone through yet. The FTC still has to check it out. That's something we'll get to later in the podcast as well. But what are Adobe's motivations behind this?
Adobe's a legacy company, like I said. Some could say they're failing. The age of having, this suite of applications is really not something anyone wants anymore. Everyone wants a one-platform business, and they saw Figma as really their number one competitor in the space. They're really fast growing. The year-over-year growth is insane. Like we said, they still were able to manage doubling revenues from a staggering number of 200 million to 400 million. So we want to think about, do you think this is really a defensive move, or what other motivations does Adobe have for this?
So I like to think of it as defensive, and I think the biggest thing that jumps to mind is when have people done things like this in the past, and have those actions been defensive or offensive? And so the first thing I think of is Facebook buying WhatsApp, for example. So we see 2008, WhatsApp starts, super small, private messaging company. Obviously, Facebook at that point had already been up and coming, and they were continuing to grow insanely rapidly. But then somewhere around 2011, Facebook starts to notice what WhatsApp is doing. They're a little bit freaked out that it's just first and foremost a social messaging platform, right? Because Facebook was starting with Messenger, which they thought was going to be the next thing. They end up buying in 2014. Facebook buys WhatsApp for, at the time, $19 billion, which I did a little inflation adjustment. That's $23 billion today, so even bigger than the actual deal we're talking about today, the Figma acquisition. But at the time, it was completely defensive. Yeah. Facebook was saying at the time that the biggest threat to their growth and to their future product success, especially for Messenger, was WhatsApp. And so, bought it out, completely wiped it off the market. I mean, it still exists in the market today, but completely eliminated a competitive threat. And so I think today when we look at what are Adobe's threats in this space, their biggest threats are these huge, new, bright, innovative game changers in the space. And that's why designers love Figma in the first place.
Exactly. It's just that one collaborative platform. But just jumping to the point about Facebook, they've been known to make these defensive maneuvers. Think about buying Instagram. Mm-hmm. But something I really want to think about is Facebook they didn't integrate WhatsApp, Instagram. They really kept them separate. Mm-hmm. But I think Adobe's going to take a different route here, and they're really going to integrate Figma. There's not going to still be, Figma by Adobe or maybe just Figma by itself. I really think they're going to make it one cohesive platform. Mm-hmm. Unlike what Facebook is doing, they kind of had this cannibalization of their same customers. We have the young people going on Instagram, old people still going on Facebook, and really no mix of it in between here. So that's one of the worries I have about Adobe trying to keep Figma separate, is they're really going to cannibalize their existing market rather than merging it.
So I mean, when we talk about that existing market too, I think at the end of the day, the UI UX space is completely driven by designers. It's a weird cultish space a little bit. Designers have these toolkits of products they use, their own product suite, if you will, and they're super culty about the things they like, and they build these online Reddit communities behind what they like. And there are actually a lot of people right now who are super unhappy with the deal from the designer end. There are massive communities of designers who are kind of outraged at what's happening because they've seen before previous acquisitions of smaller UI startups and UI integrations where their integrations and their innovation just halts once they get acquired. Do you think like what Adobe's going to do right now is like, because you mentioned they're going to integrate them into their product suite. Do you think their idea is to like keep building it or kind of just like fizzle it into what they have right now?
Yeah, so my really thought is, I was reading on TechCrunch, they had this really big idea that Adobe is essentially going to go into Figma, if you will, instead of a Figma becoming, just another part of their Creative Cloud suite. And I really think that's what's going to happen, that Adobe's going to become Figma, where you have this one cohesive platform. You're going to be on Photoshop. I could be doing it right alongside you because that really is the future, this collaborative natures of company going in the future. We can't have this, one product here, and then they combine them at the end. We really need to be working on it start to finish together to really understand the customer in that aspect for these faster and faster iterations that, the current market landscape is calling for.
So your idea right now is that, right, Adobe has bought, let's imagine 6 months from now, FTC puts a green stamp on this deal, goes through, right? Which by the way, I would say 6 months is like probably kind of liberal with that. I think it's probably like closer to a year until this goes through. Because by the way, it's essentially monopolies what they're creating of the design market.
Well, we can talk about that. These legacy companies buying startups, but we'll pump the brakes on that for now.
We'll pump the brakes for a second. So my idea, let's say, imagine they put a green stamp on the deal.
Yeah.
Next year, a year from now, is you log on to Adobe.com, and when you go to manage your subscriptions on their Creative Cloud, which is just their suite of platforms, do you have access to buy Adobe Figma, or when you log on to Figma's website, it's just Figma by Adobe? Who's retaining kind of a larger brand image and ownership here?
I think it has to be Adobe. They're not really going for a complete rebrand, I want to say, into Figma. They don't want to steal essentially Figma's thunder and say, oh, we are now Figma. Figma is our competitor. That's really kind of submitting to them, rather than they're going to take the best aspects of Figma and kind of use it to refuel Adobe in that nature and really try to take over Figma's growth for themselves and reestablish themselves as this number one player, going into the future.
See, I mean, my idea though there is that I think the most important thing to when we talk about who's retaining brand ownership, right? I think we have to loop it back to my earlier point, which is designers in the first place, right? Because designers' biggest thing is that they're afraid that they're going to go log onto Figma.com. It's going to redirect them to this old grandfather legacy product like Adobe XD that now just has little snippets of what they liked from the past. But at the end of the day, people jumped onto Figma, and I think this is something that hopefully we'll discuss in future podcasts, is people jumped onto it because it was just an insane amount of innovation happening really quickly. I mean, Figma is a sub 10-year-old startup, right? Exactly. And they've done more stuff, native real-time collaborative editing, prototyping and stitching between the UI to UX landscape. They've done stuff that hasn't been available before. And I think people's fear is that, look, we invested our time, our efforts, companies have invested enterprise level subscriptions into Figma, and now Figma is just going to revert back to what people stopped using 10 years ago. I think that's their fear here, but I could be totally wrong.
So you're kind of thinking Figma's going to fade away into the fold that is the greater, Adobe what it is.
That's my fear here. And I think, look, if we go back to what we just talked about being a defensive maneuver, I think brilliant defensive maneuver, right? They're eliminating their competition. Yeah. But I think when we look at it from the consumer's perspective, it might not be in their best interest. I think there's this real fear here that, they're going to be completely stalled.
I don't know. My thoughts are really that, like you were saying, you're going to type in Figma.com. That's going to be the same thing as typing Adobe.com. It's going to be one application, maybe just even one online platform. I know it's going to take a lot of infrastructure to really take all those separate applications, like we talked about Photoshop, Adobe XD, and bring them all into one application. But that is really what I think Adobe needs going in the future. You're not going to be able to pick and choose which different suites you want. Maybe that will based on their different subscription models they have. You have access to all of these, or you have access to only two of the products. But I do think it's going to be one interactive platform now going forward instead of multiple separate platforms.
I will say though, recent quote from Dylan Field, who's the co-founder, original co-founder of Figma and still continues on. He recently said, "Adobe is deeply committed to keeping Figma operating autonomously, and I will continue to serve as CEO." And so I think this is kind of inciting that they want them to remain completely separate. I think that there's probably a fear on his end that joining them a little bit more, like they know who their competitor is. They know that their main competitor is someone who people view as very old. And so I think like, I actually kind of disagree. I think that like, although what I'd like to think is Adobe's going to swallow them up, like I think there's going to be real pressure, and this was probably part of the deal in the first place.
Yeah, I find it very interesting because, you know, Adobe did, I believe they bought Figma with half a stock essentially, when Adobe was in the attempt of buying back stock, really doing like a reverse maneuver to buy Figma. So I wonder if like that was part of like the stipulations, how, you know, Figma, they want some stake in Adobe rather than just like becoming Adobe itself, which is interesting though. Because I don't know, because now you're talking about like keeping them autonomous. I feel like they're really just going to cannibalize their own market. Like Adobe customers are just going to become Figma customers, essentially.
I mean, from that perspective, like, do you think it's going to be like they're forced to almost? Like they have no real choice in this matter. They just get introduced to this new Figma, Adobe Figma is maybe the new service will pioneer. Like they just get introduced and they're forced to do that? Or do you think they're actually really going to lose that market?
I think they will lose that market because this ties back to, you know, like that Facebook, Instagram thing. Like Facebook really did lose that market. You know, we can see Facebook is going through their own turmoil right now. You know, they've tried other rebrands with Meta, Metaverse, not panning out. Maybe they will in the future. But my fear is that this is really just like a Facebook, Instagram parallel where this giant legacy company, Adobe, you know, they bought this very hot, up-and-coming startup, now like high-growth company. And, you know, they're just competing for the same markets in that aspect.
But so what I look at is a little bit different too. So when we think about them losing this massive market just because of, you know, the sticker price and their previous market share, let's go back to that. Let's look at when Facebook bought Instagram, right? Yeah. One of the reasons they bought Instagram is because the demographic for Instagram was way younger than Facebook.
It's true.
And they didn't want to lose out on that market. Now Figma, at the time of the purchase, had 77% of the market. And so you could say they were already a monopolist on this market. Adobe, who was kind of like poor, shriveling out, like disheveled, who's, by the way, their stock sticker price was in the down 46%, I think, over the year, something like that. This was completely like, look, we have way more money than you, but you are on a way better trajectory than us. And so I think it's like, and in this case, and this is my larger point, when Facebook bought Instagram, even though they had this dominance over the market, I don't think they lost much of their consumer base. Consumers were kind of fine that remaining with Instagram.
The existing consumer base will stay the same for Adobe. You know, Adobe's not going to lose to Figma, but I'm saying, what about the new people? You know, like we just made our logo off of Figma for free. Like you're not going to go use Adobe. Like you're going to stay with Figma. Like how can Adobe compete to get new customers then?
How can they compete to get... Well, okay, let's take it like one by one. So there's the question, how can they compete to get new customers? But then how can they retain their own customers and kind of like avoid churn, right? And so I think when it's retaining customers, it's just they have to remain... They have to kind of like garner that loyalty just by continuing their path of innovation. Like being very transparent. A quote like that from Dylan Field about him remaining on as CEO, I think is like really important. Especially for this very like invested consumer base in the design industry where people are like constantly obsessed with what they're working on. But when we look at like gathering new consumers, I don't know. I think it's like, I wonder if they're going to continue to be an industry cannibal and just go after all of these startups that we see today are already integrating with Figma. I wonder how that's going to change those integrations in the first place. I think Sahil and I were chatting about this when the deal initially happened. There are hundreds of startups now whose entire existence is dependent upon Figma, right? Like they exist so that UI designers can just pull them into the toolkit and integrate them. I mean, do you think they're going to lose all those as well, or like?
I don't know. It's just a question of what to see in the future. I think they will lose at the end of the game. They're going to pour all their money into Figma, but I still don't know. Going back to our first point of, you know, a 50x revenue multiple, if we're not seeing like Adobe's core business itself getting any increase in revenue rather than just, you know, taking on Figma's revenue.
I think maybe an interesting note on that topic is because I feel like at this point, right, like we could pick this apart all day, but I think something that's really interesting here is when you're in a position like Adobe was, where you are, although you have a ton of capital, your shareholder support is tanking, your stocks are down, people are not using your services. Figma owns 77% of the design market. Meanwhile, Adobe's been pumping millions into Adobe XD and Photoshop and Lightroom over the last 15 years. In general, like, what are your options as a company? Because they chose to make the maneuver, right? We're going to buy out this company.
Exactly.
There's also the, you could pivot to a different product. You could go target another consumer segment. Like, what are your options? Like, how do you weigh your options in that position?
Exactly. I think this makes like a good segue to our next point about, legacy companies going out and buying startups. Like, should this deal even go through, it really sets a precedent that, these legacy companies, they have all this money, billions of dollars. Can they just swallow up startups and no one can really compete anymore? Like, do we think legacy companies should be allowed to buy startups, up and coming high growth companies, like Adobe bought Figma, but does this really kill innovation, do we think? Or does it bolster it, in fact, by like having these capital injections?
Well, look, I think at the end of the day, companies are allowed to do whatever they want, right? Like, that's part of the beauty of operating in a free market. I think by the way, like with the regulation of the FTC, to make sure that you're not completely running out the competition. Yeah. I don't know. To be completely honest, like I don't know what the FTC specific regulations are. If they let Facebook buy WhatsApp, which has been heavily contested, and many people think it was a horrible decision, especially given in the last 2 years all the controversy we've seen over social media gathering people's information. I don't know. I assume the deal will go through. Otherwise, there'll be like insane scrutiny. But maybe there should be like more of a specific metric, right? Like if your market share is over X amount, like you should not be able to buy a company that is X amount close to what you do. I don't know. I think at the end of the day, like they're completely allowed to do it. Someone made a smart decision on Adobe's behalf. Whether or not you think that they're like completely erasing the competition or they're harming Figma fans out there and like stalling the design industry, they made a smart business decision.
Exactly.
Do you feel that like there should be tighter regulations on it?
No, I think the deal should be allowed to go through. My only worry is, if I'm a startup, I have a great idea. How am I going to compete against Figma now? Like, you were already unable to compete against Figma. Like you said, 77% of the market. Now they're backed by this billion-dollar public corporation. They could just do what Facebook does. Someone comes along, or like TikTok does. Someone comes along with a great idea, like Be Real did. You just make it internally now, and you just put it on your own platform. It's like an extra feature. So like, I just worry that this could like pause innovation, like you're saying, in the design space. Like, obviously, Figma will keep, progressing and innovating themselves, but I think the greatest innovation comes from the pressure of your competition, and you can see what everyone else is doing and finding new ways to beat out competition. But if you can just build something internally, how can you really compete against that?
Yeah, there's a gradient of competition, right? Like minor or like mediocre competition that helps thrive innovation, like you're talking, or helps spur innovation, like you're talking about. But when the competition owns 100% of the market, like it's not a competition; it's a brick wall. That's not competition. My question for you, though, is what do you think Canva's response is going to be now?
I don't know. Canva, I don't know if you guys have seen, they recently released like a new workspace. They're kind of competing with Google's workshop in this suite in this case, but I don't know what they're going to do. I think they might, pivot into their own niche a little bit, be more for like the beginners, they might say, with their templated versions rather than Figma's for the advanced. So kind of catering towards people that are beginning, but I wonder how they can hold on to those people, because once you can become more advanced in UI UX design, like you eventually go to Figma, but just because it's a more powerful program. But what are your thoughts? Like, how can Canva really keep on to their customers?
Look, I think Canva's like quaking right now.
Yeah.
I think they're absolutely terrified. If I'm the Canva co-founders, you're probably in talks with the FTC trying to like lobby this not to go through.
Yeah,
you're probably in talks with execs at Figma. I think their biggest thing right now is Canva attracts much more of a beginner market.
Exactly.
I think you mentioned it before, and I think you said Figma. Like our logo is straight from Canva, right? And like, what the fuck do we know? I think for Figma, like you have to be more of like an intermediate or experienced designer, and so maybe that's a market that they're gonna really try and dive after. Like I have this background fear that now this Adobe Figma carnivore is going to gobble up Canva.
Oh God! But then how do you where's your retention coming from? Like, what is stopping someone for building the skills on Canva and not just and then just leaving Canva? How do you incentivize people to stay?
I don't know the answer. I think that's something that we're gonna have to leave to discuss further in the next episode. But I'm Crockett Calloway.
I'm Sahil Seth,
and this is UNinvested.